Good morning. In the last class, we were discussing about deadlocks. I'm going to continue from where I had left. Let's quickly recall whatever we had discussed in the last class. We understood what is a deadlock state and what are the necessary conditions for deadlock to occur in a computer system. What are the necessary conditions that we discussed? Mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption, and circular wait. And we also discussed about resource allocation graph. It is a directed graph and visually represents the request that processes are making for the resources and the resources which are allocated to the processors. If we observe a cycle in this kind of a graph, then we can suspect that there is going to be a deadlock in the system. We also discussed about necessary condition and necessary and sufficient condition for deadlock to occur. For example, if we have a single instance of different resource types in a system, and when we write the resource allocation graph, and if you find a cycle, then that becomes necessary and sufficient condition for deadlock to occur. But when there are multiple instances of resources, even if there exists a cycle, that may not be necessary and sufficient condition for deadlock to occur. This is what we had discussed in the previous class. Now in today's lecture, I'm going to discuss about different methods of handling the deadlocks. Okay, let's look at the different approaches used to handle the deadlocks. The first approach is deadlock prevention. Here we try to ensure that one of the necessary conditions that we had listed does not hold good. So thereby we can prevent the deadlock. I will discuss elaborately about deadlock prevention with an example in the next slide. And what is deadlock avoidance? Deadlock avoidance is judiciously making the decision of whether to allocate the resource to the requesting process or not. Suppose let's say the P is making a request for resource R. Now we have to decide, in the sense operating system has to decide if this resource is allocated to process P, this will not lead to deadlock. So for making such decisions, operating system has to have the information such as what are the resources available, currently available, and what are the resources which are allocated, and what requests might come in the future from the processes. All this information uh, have to be available with the operating system for making a decision on whether to grant the resource or not. So this is what is known as deadlock avoidance. The next approach is allow the system to enter a deadlock state and have an algorithm to detect it and to recover from the deadlock. So this is another method used for handling the deadlock. The last one is a commonly used method for handling the deadlocks, that is ignore the problem altogether. Many of the operating systems such as Linux and Windows uses this approach. Here the operating system ignores the deadlocks, whereas it becomes the responsibility of the programmer to ensure that the program he has written will not lead to deadlock. If deadlock is ignored, then the performance of the system is going to deteriorate. So these are the four different approaches for handling the deadlocks. Now let us look at one by one elaborately. First, let me take up deadlock prevention. Okay, the first necessary condition which has to hold good in the system for causing the deadlock is this mutual exclusion. Okay, there is no way of sharing a resource among multiple processes, especially when it comes to resources like printer. So you cannot share this kind of a resource among multiple processes like P and Q, because this kind of resource or this kind of resources are intrinsically non-shareable. So some of the resources have to be used in a non-shareable mode. So there's no way of preventing mutual exclusion. This is ruled out. Now we have to look at avoiding or preventing the other three necessary conditions that we discussed about. The next necessary condition is hold and wait. You know what is hold and wait? A process P could hold a resource R, and it might R not, and it might request for another resource R1. If R1 is not available at that point of time, the P is going to wait. So this is what is known as hold and wait, and it is not going to release this resource R0. There are two protocols which are proposed to ensure that this hold and wait condition never occurs. The first protocol says that no process is allowed to make a request for resources when it is holding some resource. In other words, a process is allowed to make a request for resources only when it has none. That means it is not holding any of the resources. So there is one more protocol which says that the process should make a request for all the resources that it needs during its lifetime when it starts its execution. In other words, each process to request and be allocated all its resources before it begins its execution. Okay, the drawback of this approach is low resource utilization and starvation. Now let's take an example and try to understand these two protocols better. Yeah, you take this example. Here a process is trying to copy data from a DVD drive onto a file which is present on the hard disk, and it is sorting the file and then printing the sorted file uh, using the printer. Here what are the resources that are required by this process? It requires DVD drive, it requires file which is present on the disk, okay, and the printer. So according to our first protocol, which says that a process cannot hold a request and make request hold a resource and make request for another resource. So if you apply that protocol here, the process could make request for DVD drive and file. It can read the data from the DVD drive, write it onto the file, and then sort it. Okay, then release these two uh, resources and make the request for printer. Of course, it cannot make the request for printer alone. Now again the process has to make the request for the file and the printer, and transfer the contents of file to the printer for printing. So this is what is the first protocol. uh, which make sure that hold and wait condition never occurs, and thereby deadlock could be prevented. So the second protocol says that the process should make the request for all the resources that it needs in the beginning and see to it that all these are allocated to this process by the operating system. So that means it should request for DVD drive file which is present on the disk and the printer when it starts its execution. So it is holding all the resources that it wants and it completes its execution. What is the disadvantage of this kind of a protocol? Like I had mentioned in the previous slide, low utilization of the device. For example, printer, though this process needs the printer at the end for writing the content of the file, it is allocated to the process when the process starts the execution. So that's what is known as inappropriate utilization of the device or low utilization of the device. Now here the process might starve because some resource might be allocated to a process and that resource may not be used by the process for a long time. So this could lead to starvation. Okay, now let's see whether we can prevent no preemption. That means we can preempt the resources from the processes and give it to the processes which request for the resources. Now here let me read this first. If a process that is holding some resources requests another resource that cannot be immediately allocated to it, then all resources currently being held are released. That is, for example, let's say process P, it is holding resources R1 and R2 and making the request for R3. Now if for some reason if R3 is not allocated to process P, then process P can release R1 and R2. That's what is known as preemption. Okay, so if there is any other process in the system which is waiting for any of these resources, it can take those resources and complete its execution. That's what is the first protocol. Now because the P now waits on R3, it not just waits for R3, it should also wait for R1 R2 because it has released R1 and R2. That's what I've written here. Preempted resources are added to the list of resources for which the process is waiting. Okay, now the process P can resume its execution only when it not only gets this R3, it should also get this R1 and R2 back. Only then the process P can resume its execution. That's what I've written here. Okay, so this is one of the protocols that says preemption of resources should be possible, and thereby we can avoid deadlock from occurring. Okay, there is one more protocol which is a slight variant of the protocol that I just discussed. Here, if a process requests for some resource, first operating system checks whether the requested resources are available. If the requested resources are available, then they are allocated to the requesting process. If the requested resources are not available, and if these resources are allocated to some other process which is waiting for additional resources, then these resources could be preempted and allocated to the requesting process. That means if P is using the resources R1 and R2 and making request for R3, and if R3 is held by another process, let's say Q, which is waiting for some other resource R4. So there is no point in making this P2 wait, because this Q is holding this R3 and waiting for R4. So this R3 could be preempted from Q and given to P to complete its execution, right? This will not lead to deadlock. So this is another protocol which says resource preemption of resources should be possible. Okay, the last condition which could lead to deadlock is circular wait. Now we'll have to look at, is there any way of ensuring that this circular wait never occur. This is possible if we can impose a total ordering of all resource types, and making sure that when a process requests for a resource, it requests resources in an increasing order of enumeration. It is very simple. Let us take this example. And there are three types of resources: tape drive, disk drive, and printer. Now this is an integer which is associated with resource type tape drive, and this is an integer which is associated with resource type disk drive, and so on. Now if a process P, if it has to make a request for some resource, let's say Ri, then this f of Ri, okay, should be greater than f of Rj, where Rj is the request that this process P is holding. I hope you understood this. Let's say P is holding uh, a tape drive. So what is f of tape drive? It is equal to 1, and it is making the request for disk drive. So f of disk drive is 5, which is greater than 1. So therefore the process P is allowed to make such a request. Okay, so we now we'll have to see whether this prevents circular waiting. Let me erase this. So you assume that there are processes P0, P1, P2, so on, Pn, and let's assume that there is a circular wait. That is, P0 is waiting for a resource which is being held by P1, and P1 is waiting for a resource which is being held by P2, and so on. And Pn minus 1 is waiting for a resource which is being held by Pn, and this Pn is waiting for a resource which is held by P0. So there is a circular wait. Now according to our protocol, this P0 can make a request for resource which is being held by P1 only if f of, if it is holding a resource or not, is less than f of R1. Okay, so it is making request for R1, or you can say that f of R1 greater than R0, both are same. Okay, so that's what I have written here, and it goes on like if P1 has to make request for resource which is being held by this P2, then f of R1 should be less than f of R2, and so on. That's what I have written. Finally, if you see, if this process Pn has to make a request for resource which is held by P0, then f of, let us assume that the Pn, process Pn holds Rn, f of Rn should be less than f of R0. Only then this process Pn is allowed to make a request for resource which is held by P0. So that's what I've written here, but we can prove that this doesn't hold good. How? By transitivity, we what we get is f of r naught less than f of r naught, which is not possible. So therefore this circular weight does not hold good. Okay, so this is one of the approaches that we can use to ensure that this circular weighting never occurs. Okay, now in the next slide I'm going to talk about the next method of handling the deadlocks, that is deadlock avoidance. Deadlock avoidance is a technique adopted by the operating system to ensure that the system never goes to a deadlocked state. So for doing that, operating system has to have many information, such as maximum number of each resource type required by a process, resources that are currently available in the system, resources currently allocated to each process, and also the future requests of each process. Now, keeping all this information in mind, when a process P makes a request for resource R, the operating system checks granting of this resource to process P, whether this is going to keep the system in the safe state. If operating system finds that the system is going to remain in the safe state, only then this resource R is granted to process P. So this is what is known as deadlock avoidance. If operating system finds that the granting of resource R will lead to uh, unsafe state or leads to deadlock, then it defers granting of this resource. So let us see what is a safe state. Now here we have to check what is a safe state. I'll give the definition for the safe state in the next slide. So let's try to understand what is a safe state. Let me first define safe state. A state or a system's state is safe if the system can allocate resources to each process in some order and still avoid a deadlock. More formal way of defining this safe state is system is in a safe state only if there exists a safe sequence. Now let's try to understand what is this with an example. Now let us assume that we have some resource type. Let's say let us take tape drive or whatever you take it as hard disk. Let's assume that we have 12 tape drives connected to the system. Okay, this table indicates that there are three processes running concurrently, and the process P0 wants 10 a maximum of 10 instances of tape drives, and P1 needs maximum of 4 instances of tape drives, and P2 needs 9. So this is maximum needs of processors. Now currently let us assume 5 instances of tape drive is allocated to P0, 2 instances of tape drive is allocated to P1, and 2 instances of tape drive is given to P2. Now what is a safe state? Is this a safe state? Now out of 12, how many are currently allocated? 9. So how many are remaining? There are 3 uh, instances of tape drive are remaining. Now out of 3, P1 wants maximum of 4 instances of tape drive. So in the next time interval, operating system can allot 2 more. Out of this, it can take away 2 tape drives and allot it to P1, so that P1 can complete its execution, because it needs maximum of 4 instances of tape drive and it is given 4, so therefore it can complete its execution. Once it completes its execution, it is going to release those 4 tape drives. When it releases 4 tape drives, how many we have in the system? Now we have 5. We had 1 free, and now P1 is releasing 4 after its execution, so therefore now we have 5 for tape drives. Now we have to check, or the operating system has to check, whether this can meet need of any of the processors. Now if you look at this table, P0 needs 10 and it is currently having 5. Now if you can allot this 5 to P0, P0 can complete its execution, okay, because its maximum requirement is 10. Now execution of P0 is done, okay, P1 is done and P0 is done. Next, whether we'll have to check now after the execution of P0, P0 is going to release all the 10 instances of tape drive. Now whether that meets the requirement of P2, yes, because it needs maximum of 9 and it is now holding 2, so we can allocate 7 more instances of tape drive that will meet the requirement of P2, and P2 can execute. So if you see this, we have a safe sequence, that is P1 can eventually execute and complete its execution. After P1, P0 can complete its execution, and after that P2 can complete its execution. This is a safe sequence. If such safe sequence exists, then we say that the system is in a safe state. Hope you have understood. Now let's see what is an unsafe state. Now let's say P2 makes a request for one more instance of tape drive. Uh, this you have to keep in mind. So we have 12 instances of tape drive, and this is the current allocation of resources. If P2 makes a request for an additional tape drive, so this becomes this table, you can update this table, and this becomes 3. Now let's check whether this is a safe state. Okay, now how many more are remaining? Currently 10 instances of tape drive, of resource type tape drive, are allocated to the processors. How many are remaining? Now 2 are remaining. Whether that is going to satisfy the requirement any of the processors? Yes, it is going to satisfy the requirement of P1 because it is currently having 2, it needs 4. So P1 can complete its execution. Now after P1 completes its execution, it is going to release all the 4 tape drives. Now how many instances of tape drives we have in the system? Now only 4. Okay, now whether this is going to satisfy the requirement of any of the processors, you just check how many more P0 needs. 5 more, so it will not satisfy the requirement of P0. P2, how many more it needs? Currently it has 3, it needs 6 more. So that requirement is also not met. So the execution of processes halts here. So they cannot proceed further. The system has gone into an unsafe state, and this could lead to a deadlock. Now what is the mistake that we did here? We granted the resource one additional instance of tape drive to P2 when it made the request for it. So that's the mistake that we did, and which has taken the system to unsafe state. Okay, I hope you have understood the difference between safe state and unsafe state. Okay, a system is said to be in safe state if there exists a safe sequence of execution of processes.
Okay, otherwise the system is in unsafe state. Okay, why this is very very important? Because in deadlock avoidance algorithm, we check the granting of any resource to a requesting process will lead to an unsafe state or not. Okay, that's the idea behind deadlock avoidance algorithm. Now, keeping our discussions, whatever we had in mind, let's go ahead and look at an algorithm which uses resource allocation graph that we had talked about. Here, I am showing you a slightly modified resource allocation graph. Okay, we had discussed about two types of edges that could be present in the resource allocation graph. One is the request edge. Request edge. What is the request edge? For example, if you see this edge, P4 is making a request for R1. So this is a request edge. And there could be another type of edge, that is assignment edge. Okay, if the arrow is from the resource type to the process, then this is assignment edge. These are the two different types of edges which we had talked about when we discussed about resource allocation graph. Now here we have another kind of edge shown using dotted line, and this kind of edge is called claim edge. Okay, we can call it as claim edge. That means the process is going to claim this resource in future. That's what this edge represents. Okay, that's why I'm saying that it is a modified resource allocation graph. Now what we'll have to see is that whether we can use this graph to uh, realize deadlock avoidance algorithm. Let's assume that uh, okay, there is only single instance of each resource type. We put a dot inside the rectangular box. This rectangular box represents the resource type. Okay, if you put one single dot, it means that there is a single instance of a resource type. Okay, this is our assumption. Now we will have to see whether this resource allocation graph could be used for deadlock avoidance. Now let's see this P2 now uh, is given, it makes a request for R2. It's a claim edge, so we knew that P2 is going to make a request for R2 in the future. Now if we allot or grant this resource to P2, then what happens to this claim edge? This claim edge will be converted into request edge. How do we represent the request edge? It is the arrow gets reversed, and this dotted arrow becomes a solid line. Let us look at that. Okay, now you see here uh, the claim edge has been converted into the request edge here. When P2 makes request for R2, R2 is not immediately granted to P2. We convert the claim edge to request edge and see whether there is going to be any cycle in the resource allocation graph. Now if you look at this, yes, considering the fact that P1 is going to request for R2 in the future, there could be this scenario, right? If we grant the resource R2 to P2, that means it is taking the system to an unsafe state. what is an unsafe state? In the unsafe state, there could be a deadlock. So if we see this cycle, then we deny granting of R2 to P2, and we postpone this activity, or we are going to defer this activity. So this is how we can make use of resource allocation graph for deadlock avoidance. Unfortunately, this solution which I discussed works only for a scenario where there is going to be single instance of each resource type. Now let's see, when we have multiple instances of each resource type, which algorithm could be used for deadlock avoidance. Okay, we use an established algorithm called Banker's algorithm for deadlock avoidance. Why this has got the name Banker's algorithm? Because banks always make sure that they never go out of cash while distributing the cash to the customers who are there in the bank. So similar approach is being followed here. So therefore, this algorithm is called Banker's algorithm. Okay, in order to use this algorithm is used when we have multiple instances of resource types, and in order to use this algorithm, there are certain conditions. That is, each process must a priori claim maximum use of each resource type. So that means it should say, if there are three different types of resources in the system, let's say R1, R0, R1 and R2, and if there are processes P0 and P1 running concurrently, now we have to have a matrix of this kind. Okay, 5 to 6, etc. Now this represents that the P0 is going to use maximum of 3 instances of R0 in its lifetime, or before completing its execution, and it is going to use maximum of 4 instances of type R1, and so on. Similarly, P1 is going to use maximum of 6 instances of R2, maximum of 2 instances of R1, etc. Okay, so that information has to be available. Now when the process makes a request for a resource, OS checks whether it leads to an unsafe state. What is an unsafe state? That we are not going to have a, a safe sequence if we grant the resource requested by the process. That is checked, and if the answer is no, that means if the granting of resource will not lead to an unsafe state, then we go ahead and allot the resource to the requesting process. If the answer is yes, that means granting of the resource requested by the process takes the system to uh, an unsafe state, then the process may have to wait and allocation is deferred. Okay, so this is what is the Banker's algorithm. Now let us look at the different data structures that are used by the Banker's algorithm, and we will also take an example and see how this Banker's algorithm works. So what you have to understand clearly here is the Banker's algorithm has to check the state of the system when the process makes the request for a resource. If the state of the system is going to, it has to pretend as if it has granted the resource requested by the process, and check whether the system will remain safe. System's state will remain safe. If yes, then the resource is granted. Otherwise, the resource is not granted at that point of time. That's what is Banker's algorithm. Okay. So before we go and write the banker's algorithm, let us try to understand the data structures that banker's algorithm is going to use. Here n represents, we are going to use this n and m, okay, variables. This n represents number of processes in the system. Okay, this you have to keep in mind. And m represents number of resource types. Resource types. That means what? Now, if you have in the system resources of type R0, R1 and R2, what will be the value of m? M will be equal to 3, because there are 3 types of resources in the system. There could be multiple instances, so there could be any number of instances of this kind of resource type. For example, there could be 4 instances of type R0, 7 instances of type R1, etc., etc. But there are 3 types of resources in the system, therefore m is equal to 3, and n is number of processes which are there in the system. Now, keeping this in mind, yeah, let us proceed and see what are the data structures that this algorithm needs. The first one is available. Okay, available. What is this? This is a vector of length m. That means if there are 3 types of resources, then this available is a vector. Okay, so this is a vector which would look like this. So what is the meaning? Let us say this is a resource of type A, and this is resource of type B, and this represents resource of type C. So it means that in the system 0 instances of resource type A are there, and 7 instances of resource type B are there in the system, and 4 instances of resource type C are there in the system available, no, unallocated. That's the meaning. So it is a vector of length m, indicates that number of available resources of each type. Okay, if available is equal to k, that is in this case, if available of, let's say, B is equal to 7, okay, here k is 7, available of B, you can say available of B is equal to 7. So according to this example, that's what I have told here. If available of J is equal to K, there are K instances of resource type Rj. So in this case, available of P is equal to 7 means there are 7 instances of type resource B. Okay, that is available. Next data structure that is used by this algorithm is max. This I have already told when I started the discussion on deadlock avoidance. So there could be a matrix. For example, you can write a matrix like this: P0, P1 and P2. Here P0, P1 and P2 are processes. Now you can write 2, 4, 7. Here you can write A, B, C. So sorry, C. Okay, so what is the order of the matrix? There are 3 rows and there are 3 columns. Order of the matrix is n into m. N value is also is equal to 3. That means there are 3 processes, and m value is also equal to 3. That means there are 3 types of resources in the system. Now we build the matrix like this, something like this. So it means that if you take this vector, if you take this row or a particular element in this matrix, that is max of I comma j, I comma j. What is the value of I here? Zeroth row, I zeroth row, and the first column, that is equal to 2. Okay, and this corresponds to P naught. So P naught needs maximum of 2 instances of resource type A. That's the meaning. So that's what I've written here. Max is a n cross m matrix that defines the maximum demand of each process. If max of I comma j is equal to k, here in this case, then process Pi, that is the process P naught, okay, so I is the row, that is P naught, okay, process Pi may request at most k instances of resource type Rj. Resource type here is this A, okay. A column represents resource type and the row represents the process number, okay, whatever you write here. So for example, I write maximum of 1, I, value of I is 1, and the value of j is 2, so that means it is 4. So maximum requirement or demand of process P1 is 4 instances of resource type B. So that's what is the meaning. I hope you have understood. So the data structure available will tell us at any point of time how many instances of a particular resource type is available in the system, and the max will tell us the maximum demand of each process. It is a n cross m matrix, whereas available is a vector. So there are some more data structures used in this algorithm. Let us have a look at it. Okay, the next data structure that is used by Banker's algorithm is allocation. Here the allocation is also a n cross m matrix that defines the number of resources of each type currently allocated to each process. If you take the vector allocation of I, sorry, if you take this, if take an element of this matrix, allocation of I comma j equals k, then the process Pi is currently allocated uh, k instances of resource type Rj. I hope you understood. Let us take an example. Uh, okay, so it is a matrix of order n cross m. How many number of rows will be there? That will be equal to number of processes running in the system, and how many columns would be there depends on how many types of resources are available in the system. Suppose if 4 types of resources are available in the system, then this matrix would have 4 columns and 3 rows, okay, like this. So on. Okay, this represents how many instances of each resource type are allocated to a particular process. For example, you take this. So what is this? This is allocation of what is the value of I here? Allocation of the value of I is 0, and what is the value of j here? The value of j is 1. That is equal to 6, which is nothing but k in this case. It means what? Process P0 is currently allocated 6 instances of resource type 1. You can take this as resource type 0, 1, 2 and 3. 3. But that's what is the meaning. This is about allocation. The next kind of data structure that is going to be used by this banker's algorithm is need. So this is also a matrix. Let me erase this. This is also a matrix of order n cross m, indicates the remaining resource need of each process. That is, if need of I comma j equals k, then process pi may need k more instances of resource type rj to complete its task. Okay, so that is, let us say we have a matrix like this of order 2 cross 3. Okay, a b c. This is of resource type a. Let's number this 0 1 and 2, and we have elements in this matrix like this. Okay, now if you take this is equal to need of, what is the value of I? You have to tell me. Need of row number, that is 1, means that it is the need of process P1. What is the column number? That is 1. That is equal to 4. 4 is k here. So this process 1 P1 needs 4 more instances of resource type 1, which is nothing but resource type B. That's the meaning. So this is another data structure which is used by the banker's algorithm. Let us quickly recall what are the data structures that are going to be used by the banker's algorithm. Once we understand what are the data structures, we can actually write the algorithm and understand how banker's deadlock avoidance algorithm works. So this is very important that you understand the data structures used. First one is the available. Available is a vector, and each element in this vector tells us how many instances of a particular resource type is available in the system. And max is a n cross m matrix, and each element in this matrix tells us how many maximum number of instances of a particular resource type are required by a process pi. For example, if you take max of I comma j, then where I is the process identification and j is the resource type that represents the resource type. Okay, so available and max. Other two data structures that are used by this algorithm: allocation. The allocation will give us at any point of time how many instances of a resource type is allocated to a particular process. Here it is a n cross m matrix. And we use one more data structure for realizing the banker's algorithm, that is need. This need uh, represents how many more instances of a particular resource type is required by a process, right? So need, how you can calculate the need? We know how many maximum number of instances of a resource type is required by a process, and if you subtract how many are currently allocated to that process, you will get the need. For example, a process, let's say P naught, wants maximum of 7 instances of a particular resource type A, and it is currently given 5. So this represents max, and this represents need of process P naught. So if you I made a mistake here. Okay, how many instances of this type are allocated to P naught? Now if you subtract this from this, you will get the need. That need is how many more instances of type resource type A or required by process P0. So these are the data structures that are used in the Banker's algorithm. Uh, Let me stop here. In the next class, I'm going to discuss about the Banker's algorithm and how it works. Thank you.